Welcome back, everyone. Today's deep dive is going to be into Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money.
Oh, yeah. I love that book.
Yeah, it's a good one. And, we've got a ton of excerpts here. I mean, we've got risk, luck, the history of booms and busts.
Oh, yeah. It really gets you thinking.
Yeah, so where should we start?
Well, I think what makes Housel's book so interesting is that it's not just about, the technical stuff. He's really focused on the psychology.
Yeah. Right.
Like why we do what we do with money.
Right, like it's not enough to just know what to do. It's about actually doing it.
Exactly. Like he's got this story about this guy, a tech millionaire.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
So he was working as a valet,
Mm.
and this guy, he designed like a key component for Wi-Fi routers.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so obviously a genius.
Right. But then, his behavior with money was totally the opposite. Like flashing cash, bragging about how rich he was.
I think he was doing a lot of that while intoxicated, too.
Yeah, often while intoxicated.
Mhm.
And he'd just give thousands of dollars to colleagues for no reason.
It seems a little immature for a tech millionaire.
It really makes you wonder, right? Like, what's going on there?
Like, here's this brilliant guy, but he can't seem to handle money.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how even the smartest people can make irrational financial decisions.
So it's not just about knowing what to do, it's about the psychology behind it.
Absolutely. Like, our emotions, our experiences, they all play a part.
Like, I was thinking about how everyone has, their own background with money, right?
Oh, totally.
Like, if you grew up poor, your relationship with risk is going to be way different than someone who came from, a wealthy family.
Exactly. Housel calls it your money history. And he says it's like the first step to making good financial decisions.
Like, someone who lived through, crazy high inflation, they probably wouldn't trust bonds as much.
Right. Compared to someone who's only known stable prices.
It's like we're all playing the same game, but with different rules.
And it explains why people react so differently to the same financial situations.
He even brings up JFK, right?
Yeah, how JFK didn't experience the Great Depression firsthand, and it actually became a political problem for him.
Yeah, it's like your personal financial history really shapes how you see the world.
Absolutely. Like how you think about risk, saving, investing. It's all connected.
But it's not just our personal experiences that shape our financial outcomes, right?
Oh, for sure not.
Like, we can't just ignore luck and risk.
Totally. And this is where the Bill Gates example comes in.
Right, like being in the right place at the right time.
Housel compares Gates to his friend Kent Evans. Both were super smart students, but Evans died young in a climbing accident.
And Gates obviously became a billionaire.
Shows how luck can play a huge part even when you've got talent and you're working hard.
So how do we even learn from these success stories if we can't separate skill from luck?
It's tough.
We don't want to oversimplify things.
Definitely tricky. Housel says to be careful about taking away simple lessons from extreme success or failure.
Like John D. Rockefeller and Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Exactly. They were both incredibly successful, but they took a lot of risks. And let's be honest, some of what they did was illegal.
Yeah, where's the line between bold and reckless?
It gets blurry.
You can't just ignore the context of their time.
It's a good reminder to look deeper than the headlines and really understand the situation before you start idolizing anyone.
So we've talked about personal experiences and luck and risk. But what about one of the most basic concepts in finance? Compounding.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
And Housel uses Warren Buffett as an example.
He does. And get this, most of Buffett's wealth was built after he turned 50.
Really? Most people are thinking about retirement at that age, not making billions.
It's insane.
It
just shows how powerful time is when it comes to compounding. Housel says, imagine Buffett started investing later, but still made the same returns.
So even with the same skill, but starting later, he wouldn't have as much.
Yeah, exactly. His wealth would be way lower.
Time really is money.
Right. And he compares Buffett to Jim Simons. Simons actually had higher average annual returns.
But because he started later?
Yeah, his total wealth is way less than Buffett's.
So it's not just how much you earn, it's how long that money has time to work for you.
And Housel says that compounding isn't intuitive. We see those small gains at first and we think it's slow.
But over time, it builds and builds.
He compares it to the growth of hard drive storage. For years it was slow, but then bam, it exploded.
It's the same with compounding. Those gains get bigger and bigger over time.
And because we don't always see it, we underestimate its power, especially when the market's going up and down all the time.
Which is why patience is so important, right?
Absolutely. And to show this, House compares two very different people, Jesse Livermore and Warren Buffett.
Okay, so Livermore was a trader, right?
Yeah, super talented, but he made and lost fortunes multiple times. He ended up taking his own life.
It's like a cautionary tale almost.
Totally. Like, don't get too confident and don't get caught up in the short term.
And then you have Buffett, who just kept going steadily for decades.
Slow and steady wins the race. Like I said, the stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient.
I love that quote. So Buffett was the patient one.
He was. And Housel also quotes a venture capitalist named Michael Moritz, who said something like, "We've been lucky to be alive for a long time."
So he was talking about more than just living a long time.
Right. He was talking about the importance of sticking it out, enduring, to achieve success.
It's fascinating to see how these two guys, Livermore and Buffett, approached risk and time so differently.
And how it played out in their lives. Like Livermore couldn't handle the ups and downs, but Buffett, with his long-term vision, became one of the richest people ever.
And speaking of long-term thinking, what about saving?
Oh, that's where Housel gets into this really cool idea of defining wealth as what you don't see.
I love that. It's not about the fancy stuff, it's what you've built without showing off.
He uses the example of like an exotic car show. You see all these amazing cars, but you have no idea about the owner's finances.
Maybe they're drowning in debt.
Right. And he quotes Rihanna's financial advisor who said something like, "Was it really necessary to tell her that if you spend money on things, you'll end up with the things and not the money?"
Uh-huh. So true, though.
It's like a reminder that saving isn't about deprivation. It's about having choices in the future.
It's about creating a gap between your income and your spending.
And Housel says that having enough is more important than always wanting more. So like, what does enough mean for you?
That's a great question. Does your spending match up with what you think is enough?
It's about being intentional.
And making sure your spending reflects what you really want for the long term.
And speaking of being intentional, Housel spends a lot of time talking about room for error.
Yeah.
And he uses this interesting analogy about blackjack.
Oh yeah, blackjack. Okay, how does that relate to personal finance?
So in blackjack card counters, don't think they'll win every hand. Even if they have a slight advantage, they know there will be losing streaks.
So they have to manage their bets carefully.
Exactly. To avoid going broke from bad luck.
So it's about being prepared for when things go wrong.
And not betting everything on a single hand. He even quotes this successful card counter, Kevin Lewis.
Oh yeah, what did he say?
He said something like, "Although card counting is statistically proven to work, it does not guarantee you will win every hand, let alone every trip you make to the casino.
Oh.
We must make sure that we have enough bankroll to ride out those inevitable losing streaks that occur in any gambling or investing venture."
That's a great quote.
So just like those card counters need to handle losing streaks, investors need to handle market downturns.
Without being forced to sell at the worst time.
Exactly. And Housel uses Bill Gates as an example. Gates always wanted enough cash to cover Microsoft's payroll for a whole year.
Wow, even if there was no revenue coming in.
Yeah, it shows how important it is to be resilient and plan for the unexpected.
It's like having that safety net.
That awareness of needing room for error, of weathering those storms, it's crucial for long-term financial success.
Okay, so we've talked about personal experiences, luck, risk, compounding, saving, and room for error. But what about narratives? Housel talks about how the stories we tell ourselves about money really matter, right?
Oh, they absolutely do.
I remember that story about the alien who visits Earth in 2007 and then again in 2009.
Yeah, he's so confused.
Because the physical world looks the same, but people are acting completely different.
The cities, the factories, the resources are all there, but people's attitudes have changed.
And Housel says that's because the story changed. In 2007, it was all about optimism and growth.
But by 2009, after the financial crisis, it was all fear and uncertainty.
So even though the basic facts of the economy were similar, our feelings about them were totally different.
And that change in feeling actually had a big impact on the economy, like it became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So the stories we tell ourselves really do shape our reality.
And they shape our financial decisions too. It's crucial to think about the narratives you believe in. Are they helping you or holding you back?
That's a great question.
It's about recognizing how those stories can affect your choices and your overall well-being.
That's a good place to stop for now, I think.
Sounds good. It's like those stories affect our choices and even how happy we are.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue to this idea Housel talks about money giving you control over your time.
Yeah, that's a big one for me too.
Yeah.
It's not about buying fancy stuff. It's about freedom.
To choose how you spend your time, who you spend it with.
Right. To make choices that matter to you. not choices you have to make because of money. Housel calls it unspent assets.
Unspent assets. So it's not just how much money you have, but having money that's ready to give you options.
Exactly. It's like a cushion that lets you try new things, take risks, even walk away from bad situations.
Like having a safety net so you can explore without being afraid.
He tells the story about how he wanted to be an investment banker in college.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
He was obsessed with getting that big salary. He even had a summer internship at a fancy firm in LA.
He thought he'd made it.
Right. But he quickly learned that those big salaries come with a price
Crazy hours, tons of pressure.
and almost no control over his time.
Like he was selling his life to his job.
It just shows you money can't buy back time.
It makes you wonder if we've given up too much for money.
Housel says there's not much evidence that Americans are happier now than they were in the 1950s, even though we have more wealth
We have bigger houses and fancier cars, but are we actually happier?
and the kind of work we do has changed a lot too since then.
It's like we're always on, even when we're not working.
It's hard to disconnect and actually rest.
So how do we find that balance
Mhm.
between being financially secure and having freedom?
Well, Housel says we need to redefine what wealth really means.
It's not about the Lamborghini at the car show, it's more than that.
It's about what you don't spend, about having assets that give you options, not just a bunch of stuff.
It's about sleeping well at night, knowing you're ready for anything.
And that brings us back to saving right.
Yeah, Housel's a big advocate for saving.
He says people are basically in three groups when it comes to saving: those who save, those who think they can't, and those who think they don't need to.
He's really talking to those last two groups.
The ones who think it's impossible or unnecessary.
Like he's trying to show them that saving is possible and essential.
He says we need to change how we think about saving. It's not just about a rainy day, it's about that gap between your income and spending.
So you have more control.
Right. And he brings up the 1970s oil crisis.
That's like his go-to example.
He says we got through that crisis not by finding more oil, but by being more efficient with the energy we had.
So like making our cars more fuel efficient, being smarter about how we use energy.
Right. We did more with less. And he says saving money is like that.
Like increasing your financial efficiency.
Exactly. You're not earning more, but your money's going further.
You're stretching your budget.
And he calls this financial conservation.
I love that term.
It's something you have control over, not like investment returns, which are up to the market.
So even if you don't make a lot, you can still save by spending less.
Right. And Housel says saving isn't all about giving things up. He says after a certain point, what you actually need is often less than what your ego wants.
Oh, I've definitely been there. Like thinking I needed something when really I just wanted it.
It's so easy to get caught up in that consumer mindset.
You think you need the latest gadget, the fancier vacation.
But Housel says think of saving as that difference between your ego and your income.
Resist the urge to always upgrade your lifestyle.
Focus on building a strong base,
He talks about the benefits of wealth that you don't see.
like taking time off without worrying about money.
Or choosing a career you love, even if it doesn't pay a ton.
Those are things you can't put a price tag on.
It's about having the freedom to make choices that align with your values.
And Housel brings up this idea of being pretty reasonable with your finances.
So not aiming for perfection, but for something that works for you.
Exactly. We're not robots. We have emotions, and they affect our choices.
Sometimes the best choice is the one that gives you peace of mind.
He gives the example of Harry Markowitz.
Oh, the economist who won a Nobel Prize.
Yeah. He came up with all these formulas for building the perfect investment portfolio.
But then he didn't even use those formulas for his own retirement.
He just split his money evenly between stocks and bonds.
Really? That's so simple.
But it worked for him. It gave him peace of mind. So maybe pretty reasonable is better than perfectly rational.
Especially when it comes to investing.
It takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
You're not trying to time the market perfectly.
You're just building a solid portfolio that matches your goals.
And he also says to find investments that you're actually interested in.
That's different from the usual advice to be unemotional about investing.
But when you're invested in something you care about, you're more likely to stick with it.
Even when the market gets crazy. He talks about Bill Gurley, the venture capitalist,
He invests in index funds for stability.
but he also invests in companies he's excited about.
It's like he's putting his money where his heart is.
And it shows how important it is to find an invading strategy that not only makes financial sense, but that you personally connect with.
And, all this ties into forecasting. Trying to predict what the economy and the stock market will do.
Oh yeah, I'm always skeptical of those predictions.
Housel is too. He says a lot of those forecasts aren't reliable.
Because unlike things like weather or geology, the economy is driven by people.
And people are unpredictable.
So you can't really use historical data to make accurate predictions.
Right. It's not like predicting the tides. Housel actually quotes Michael Batnick.
Oh, what did he say?
Something like, experience in past markets isn't always a good guide for the future.
Because things change, what worked before might not work now.
Exactly. Like trying to drive using only your rear view mirror. You can see where you've been, but not where you're going.
So don't rely too much on historical data.
It can give you a false sense of security. You might miss those surprises that come along.
It's like Daniel Kahneman said. The correct lesson to learn from surprises is that the world is surprising.
So we need to be humble. We can't predict everything.
So we can't rely on predictions. How do we make good investment decisions?
Housel says instead of trying to see the future, we should focus on building a portfolio that can handle anything.
So diversification, long-term thinking.
Being able to ride out those market ups and downs.
It's about having a solid plan.
And he also points out that the stock market itself has changed a lot over time. Like the S&P 500 didn't even include financial stocks until 1976.
So using data from before then to predict today's market wouldn't make sense.
Context is important. We need to be aware of those big changes.
So we've talked about the limits of predictions and needing a good strategy, but this all comes back to room for error, right?
It does. We can't get rid of uncertainty and randomness.
But we can create a bigger gap between what we think will happen and what could happen.
While still being able to recover if things go wrong.
Like the blackjack players managing their bets.
And Bill Gates having enough cash to cover payroll even with no revenue.
It's about creating that buffer.
And Housel connects this to Benjamin Graham's idea of a margin of safety.
Graham's like the father of value investing, right?
That's him. And he said the margin of safety is there to make predictions unnecessary.
So even if you're wrong about the future, you're protected.
It's acknowledging that you can't know everything.
This is especially important when it comes to investing because emotions can really get in the way.
Fear and greed can mess up your thinking.
You need to make clear decisions even when the market's volatile.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Personal history, luck, risk, compounding, saving, room for error. But there's one more thing Housel talks about that's really interesting.
What's that?
Changing your mind.
Like being flexible.
Exactly. It's something most financial planning doesn't account for. We tend to think our goals will stay the same.
But they change all the time. He tells that story about his friend who became a doctor.
He worked so hard to achieve his dream.
But then he realized he wasn't happy.
It shows that what we think will make us happy can change.
We're not always good at predicting our future selves.
Housel calls it the end of history illusion.
So like we imagine a goal and it seems great.
But we don't think about how our values might change along the way.
Like what seemed like a dream job a few years ago doesn't seem so great now.
Our needs and desires change, and our financial plans should too.
So don't be afraid to change your mind.
Build flexibility into your plans. He even suggests aiming for balance in your life.
Moderate savings, moderate free time, moderate time with family.
You're not going overboard in any one area.
Finding that sweet spot.
That way you're more likely to stick with your plan and avoid regrets.
It's about finding balance so you can adapt to life's changes.
And he also says to be willing to let go of sunk costs.
Those things you've already put effort into but can't get back.
It's hard to do, but sometimes you have to move on.
We get attached to our past decisions even when they're not working anymore.
Housel quotes Jason Zweig talking about Daniel Kahneman. Zweig says, "The most impressive thing about Kahneman is that he seems to have no sunk costs in the finance world."
So Kahneman is willing to walk away from things, even if he's put a lot of work into them.
It's a reminder that holding on to those past decisions can keep you from moving forward.
So cut your losses and learn from your mistakes.
Sometimes the best choice is to walk away, even if it means admitting you were wrong.
And that takes guts.
But it can be a huge relief.
So we've covered flexibility and changing your mind. But Housel also talks about the hidden costs of success.
He says we don't always see the emotional and mental toll that uncertainty can have on us.
Like we focus on the rewards and forget about the potential downsides.
He uses the example of Jeff Immelt, the CEO of General Electric.
GE was this huge company.
But then they had a bunch of problems and the financial crisis hit them hard.
And everyone blamed Immelt.
But Housel says leading a big company during tough times is really hard.
The pressure must be intense.
He says the price of success is often paid in fear, doubt, uncertainty, and regret.
It's like that saying, heavy is the head that wears the crown.
We romanticize success, but forget about the sacrifices.
And he says this idea of trying to avoid uncertainty is everywhere.
Not just with CEOs, but with regular investors too.
We all want to get something for nothing.
Like he says, imagine you want a car that costs $30,000. You can pay for it, find a used one, or steal it.
Most people wouldn't steal it.
Because there are consequences.
But in investing, people try to do the equivalent of stealing the car.
They want the returns without the volatility.
So they try to time the market or chase those hot stocks.
And Housel says the money gods don't like that. You can't get a reward without paying the price.
It's like trying to cheat at a game.
He says people who try to time the market often do worse than those who just buy and hold.
It's like the irony of trying to avoid the cost of volatility is you end up paying more.
In missed returns and stress.
So be patient, have a plan, and stick with it.
He also talks about the danger of focusing too much on short-term results. He uses the example of Jack Welch.
GE's CEO before Immelt.
He was known for always beating those quarterly earnings estimates.
Like he was a superstar CEO.
But Housel says those small wins turned into big losses later on.
Like they were hiding their problems.
Sacrificing long-term health for short-term gains.
It's a reminder that real success takes time.
It's not about tricks or quick fixes.
And this brings us back to volatility being a fee, not a fine.
Like the price of admission to the market.
Like buying a ticket to Disneyland.
You pay for the experience.
It's a great way to look at it.
It's part of the process, not something to be afraid of.
So don't try to avoid it.
Okay, so we've talked about the price of success and how to think about volatility. What else does Howells talk about?
What else? Oh yeah. He says investors often take cues from others who are playing a different game.
Yeah, he challenges this idea that there's one right price for an asset.
Because investors have different goals and time frames.
What's a good price for one person might be terrible for someone else.
So like how much should you pay for Google stock today?
It depends entirely on who you are. Like if you're investing for 30 years, you can be patient.
You can ride out those ups and downs.
Focus on the long term.
But if you're a trader, your focus is different. You might only be thinking about days or weeks.
Exactly. So a price that seems crazy to a long-term investor might be perfect for a trader.
And vice versa.
And that's where problems happen. When long-term investors try to play the short-term game.
Or the other way around. He uses the example of the dot-com bubble.
All those internet companies with crazy valuations.
People were buying anything with the dot-com in the name.
But a lot of those investors weren't in it for the long term. They just wanted to make a quick profit.
And for a while it worked.
But when the bubble burst, the long-term investors who got caught up in the hype lost a lot of money.
So know your goals and your time frame. Don't get distracted by what other people are doing.
Stay focused on your own plan.
Don't get caught up in someone else's game. Speaking of different perspectives, Housel also gets into optimism and pessimism.
How they affect our financial decisions.
It's hard to know what to believe sometimes. There's so much news, both good and bad.
Housel tells this story from December 2008, right in the middle of the financial crisis.
Yeah, what was it?
The Wall Street Journal published an article about this Russian professor, Igor Panarin.
What are you saying?
He was predicting that the U.S. was going to collapse, break up into smaller countries. California would join Canada, and Alaska would go back to Russia.
Wow, that's pretty wild.
But people were paying attention to him. Maybe because things were so scary at the time.
Like, when things are bad, we want someone to tell us why. Even if it sounds crazy.
We're more likely to believe bad news than good news.
It's like we're wired for negativity.
And Housel says that affects how we see money, too.
We focus on the risks more than the opportunities.
But Housel challenges this negativity. He says it's good to know the risks, but it's also important to remember how resilient people are.
Like, the stock market has always gone up over the long term.
He says the S&P 500 has returned about 10% per year on average over the last century.
So even if you invested at the worst possible times, you'd still have made money if you held on long enough.
Of course, past performance doesn't guarantee future results.
But it shows that the market rewards patience and optimism.
And he talks about how markets adapt to challenges.
Yeah.
Like the oil crisis in the early 2000s.
Everyone thought we were running out of oil.
Experts predicted we were headed for disaster.
But they didn't consider how the market would adapt.
As oil prices went up, it encouraged innovation,
Fracking.
which led to more oil production.
So those predictions were totally wrong.
It shows how markets change and how problems can create their own solutions.
and how extrapolating from the present can lead to bad predictions.
Just because something's happening now doesn't mean it'll keep happening.
We have to be open to change.
Housel also says we give too much importance to recent events, especially bad ones.
They stick in our minds more.
He says progress is slow and setbacks are sudden.
Good news is boring, bad news is exciting.
Think about how much healthcare and technology have improved over the last 100 years.
Those changes were gradual.
But we tend to focus on the latest crisis or market crash.
Because those things grab our attention.
So it's important to step back and look at the big picture.
Things are often better than they seem.
Now let's go back to narratives for a minute. We talked about them before, but Housel really dives into how powerful they are.
Especially when it comes to the economy.
Like that alien visiting Earth in 2007 and 2009.
He's confused because the physical world looks the same.
But people are acting differently.
And it's because the story has changed.
In 2007, it was optimism and growth.
By 2009, it was fear and collapse.
Even though the underlying facts of the economy were similar, our feelings about them were totally different.
And that change in feeling affected the economy itself.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So those stories we tell ourselves really do matter.
Housel says one reason those narratives are so powerful is confirmation bias.
Like we look for information that supports what we already believe.
And ignore anything that challenges it. He uses this example from the documentary How to Live Forever.
Oh yeah, what was it?
This woman who lived to be 100 is asked about the happiest day of her life. And she says, Armistice Day.
The end of World War I.
And they ask her why. And she says, because we knew there would be no more wars ever again.
Of course she was wrong.
It shows how much we want things to be a certain way.
We believe what we want to believe.
Another reason those narratives are so strong is that they help us make sense of the world.
Which can be really confusing.
We want things to be predictable. So we latch on to stories that explain things even if they're oversimplified.
We don't like uncertainty, so we create stories to give us a sense of control.
And this is really powerful in finance because the stakes are high and the future is unknown.
Like, why do people listen to financial experts on TV even when those experts have been wrong so many times in the past?
It's because we want to believe there's an easy way to get rich.
We want to believe there's a secret formula.
We get so focused on the potential reward that we ignore the low odds of success.
It's like playing the lottery. We know it's unlikely, but we still buy the ticket.
And Housel says, once we choose a side, an investment strategy or an economic belief, we get really attached to it.
We're invested in it.
Not just financially, but mentally.
It becomes part of who we are.
And we don't want to question it even when there's evidence that we should.
So how do we avoid these traps?
Housel says we have to be aware of our biases. We have to look for different perspectives.
And be willing to question what we believe.
Even when it's uncomfortable. And he uses this interesting historical example to show how our thinking about money has evolved. He talks about Julius Wagner-Jauregg.
Who's that?
He was an Austrian doctor who won the Nobel Prize in 1927 for his work on syphilis. He was an Austrian doctor who won the Nobel Prize in 1927 for his work on syphilis.
Syphilis, wow. That was a serious problem back then.
It was. No cure at the time. And Wagner-Jauregg noticed that sometimes when his patients had high fevers, their syphilis symptoms would go away.
So what, he gave them fevers on purpose?
Well, yeah, kind of. He infected them with malaria.
Malaria? That seems a little extreme.
I know, right? But it worked. The fevers would kill the syphilis bacteria.
Wow, that's crazy. But I guess desperate times.
Of course, once penicillin was discovered, nobody did that anymore.
Makes sense.
But Housel uses this story to show how medical practice has changed.
Like how doctors used to make all the decisions.
Exactly. They thought they knew best, didn't even need to ask the patient what they wanted.
But that changed over time.
Yeah, as medicine got better and people started talking about patient rights, the focus shifted.
It became more about the patient as a person, not just their disease.
And now it's normal for doctors to talk to their patients about different options.
It's more of a collaboration.
Right. And Housel compares this to finance. He says there's no one right way to manage money.
Just like there's no one right way to treat every patient.
Everyone has different goals, different levels of risk they're comfortable with.
What works for one person might be a disaster for someone else.
So just like doctors need to talk to their patients, financial advisors should really listen to their clients.
Understand what they want and help them make a plan that fits their life.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for you, not trying to force everyone into the same box.
It's about having a financial advisor who's a partner, not a boss.
And it's about understanding the stories we tell ourselves about money.
Oh yeah, those narratives. Helsel talks about going to this fancy car show.
Lamborghinis, Ferraris, all that.
I used to think that was the definition of success.
Like if you had one of those cars, you'd made it.
But Helsel realized something interesting at that car show. He didn't really pay attention to the drivers.
It was all about the cars themselves.
Like it was the object, the symbol of wealth that mattered, not the person.
Right. And it made him think, do these things really make you happy?
Or are they just a way to show off? Like, what are we really chasing?
We tend to judge wealth by what we see, the expensive stuff.
But we don't see the costs, the debt, the sacrifices behind it.
And he makes this distinction between being rich and being wealthy.
Okay, so rich is about income, what you earn.
Exactly. But wealthy is about assets, what you've built.
It's not about the money coming in, it's about what you do with it.
And true wealth is often invisible.
Invisible, what does that mean?
It's the money you don't spend, the things you resist buying. It's having that cushion, that safety net.
So you can handle surprises, pursue your passions, live a life you believe in.
And it's about feeling secure, knowing you're prepared for whatever happens.
That's what I want, to build a life that's rich in experiences and relationships, not just stuff.
And a big part of that is saving. House says a lot of people struggle with saving.
Either they think they can't or they don't think they need to.
And he's trying to reach those people, show them that saving is possible and important.
Like, it's not just about putting money aside, it's about changing your mindset.
He uses that oil crisis example again. We didn't solve that problem by finding more oil. We got more efficient with the energy we had.
We adapted.
And that's what saving is like, increasing your financial efficiency.
Making your money go further.
And he challenges this idea that saving means giving up everything you enjoy. After a certain point, what you need is often less than what you think you want.
Oh, I've been there, thinking I needed something when really it was just my ego wanting it.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
Always wanting more.
But Housel says, think of saving as the difference between your ego and your income.
Focus on what really matters, not what other people think you should have.
It's about your values, not what society tells you to value.
So to wrap up this deep dive into the psychology of money, what are the big things to remember?
First, know your own money history, how your past experiences shape your relationship with money.
Understand yourself.
Second, remember luck and risk. We can't control everything.
Be realistic about the ups and downs.
Third, use the power of compounding. Start early and let time work for you.
Small steps can lead to big results.
Fourth, decide what enough means for you. Don't get caught in the trap of always wanting more.
Find that balance between financial security and living a life you love.
And finally, find a way to manage your money that gives you peace of mind.
There's no one right answer. It's about what works for you.
It's your journey. And it's about more than just money. It's about living a good life.
This has been a great deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone.